Should we start with Bayer Leverkusen, fighting on two fronts, domestically and in the Champions League, and, well, doing quite well in the Champions League, I think it's fair to say, Andy.
Yeah, 2 out of 2 for them, having won that first game away at Feyenoord, which is not an easy trip, with some comfort in the end, and then beating Milan this week. And I think the notable thing is they won those games in two very different ways. Now, I know you can look at the scores and say that's obvious. I don't think it is really obvious, because if you go back to the first game in Feyenoord, it looks easy because they're 4-0 up through half-time, cruise through the second half, etc., etc., etc. They're under the pump from Feyenoord early on in that game. They defend well, they deal with it well, and then just pick them off with their superior quality as the half goes on. Now, I think to do a more modern, or modern's not the right word, recent comparison, if you compare what Leverkusen were able to do against Milan to the game where they went away to Bayern at the weekend, they got the result they wanted from Bayern and defended very well. They defended very well again against Milan for the most part of it, but whilst managing to remain aggressive. Whereas their approach was a little bit more wait and see away at Bayern at the weekend. As I think maybe you would expect it for a lot of teams going to Bayern, but not necessarily Leverkusen, because that is not really their thing. And we have to say they haven't defended particularly well so far this season. But against Milan, they were able to take the game to them, boss the first hour, get over the fact that they weren't winning at half-time when they really should have been, because they were by far the best team for the first hour, get their goal after half-time, and then switch to defend smartly in the last bit of the game to close the game. So I think if we're looking at Xabi Alonso's spell at Leverkusen overall, there are so many different incarnations. We were talking before we came on, weren't we, about the 3 lives of Elvis? Well, this is what Xabi Alonso's Leverkusen are like. There are so many different faces to them. You can't look at the way they are playing at a certain point and go, that's Alonso's Leverkusen. You can't say that, because they've got so many tricks up their sleeve. And that's why he's managed to adapt to different situations going along. Of course, he inherited like a relegation struggler, went to a Europe challenger, and then got to the point where they're league and cup champions.
Arguably, though, and Nicky, they're not newcomers to the Champions League. We shouldn't be surprised that they're doing well. Is it how well they're doing that makes them potential dark horses in the tournament?
I so wish I was good enough on my Elvis knowledge to come in with like a nice continuation of the Elvis riff. I do think they've shown real variety in this season so far. The Feyenoord game is a great example, Dotun, of what you're just saying there about them. They're not new here. They've been here before. And in fact, there was a real sense of almost, at times, almost dangerously overconfident swagger about them in that game. I'm thinking about Boniface's no-look pass, was it on the opening goal, with the faking to use his right and then using his left for the no-look pass. And it's one of those things where when it works, and it did, it just looks incredible. But as Andy mentioned, there were times in that game where they were on the back foot and they weren't defending that well. I'm not certain, even though the scoreline looks wide in that game, that there wasn't quite a realistic world in which they just concede early to Feyenoord and the whole game goes very differently. But then I think in a couple of the biggest games recently, they've shown very different faces. Against Bayern Munich again, being able to sit and absorb and not let themselves get overrun despite giving up the ball almost entirely. And then the Milan game was a really intelligently approached game from Alonso, because Fonseca had Milan in this very congested, narrow setup, and you saw Leverkusen just deliberately exploit that by going right to left, left to right with these long angled ball across the pitch, and Florian Wirtz being the flexible forward that he is, drifting to each flank at the right times. And this isn't happening by accident. This is all planned by Alonso. And I think if there's one thing that's absolutely beyond question right now, it's that Alonso has shown that he's certainly no one-hit wonder. He's certainly got an Elvis-like depth to his back catalogue, I guess.
Yeah, and he's got the vision, hasn't he? I think that's the point, because again, you look at the squad with Leverkusen. You think, well, they haven't really changed, have they? But they've made a couple of small but significant changes which will stand them in good stead over the season. Like Nicky was talking there about the way they switched play from left to right, particularly in the first half of that game against Milan. Who was the key to that? Alex Garcia, a new player who's just come in this season from Girona, who he was brilliant for them last season. He pulled it all together in midfield, despite, of course, Dovbyk and Tsigankov getting all the headlines there, and quite rightly so, because they were excellent as well. But I don't think he has a set team at the moment. He doesn't have a gala 11. He just thought, this is a game for Alex Garcia, and pops him in the midfield. And, you look at the bench they've got, and partly that's because they've got so many good players that, they're able to do that. I think you look at some of their big games at the end of last season where Alonso goes, you know what, okay, Florian Wirtz is my best player, but I'm going to use him as a finisher in this game. So I'm going to bring him on with half an hour left. Even in the game that they won a title, of course, against Werder Bremen, he came on and scored a hat-trick in that game. Now, part of that, of course, was due to the volume of games that they were playing in the home straight of last season. But still, if you ask me what is Xabi Alonso's preferred 11, I wouldn't have an answer for you.
But arguably, though, they've still got some work to do, haven't they, Nicky? They're not the finished article yet. And I wonder whether it's the domestic league that is going to sort of be the more important tournament to fix what the problems are in for Leverkusen, just because they haven't had a clean sheet there. They're playing a high-risk game there, aren't they?
Yeah, well, Alonso talked about this after the Milan game, that the Milan and Bayern present very different challenges. And what he talked about is German teams will try to jump on you and play you very high up the pitch, whereas Italian teams might wait for you a little bit more. And I think that's obviously a generalisation, and perhaps one that Alonso knows better than anyone, because of course an Italian team did jump them high up the pitch in the final of the Europa League, Atalanta, and did get the better of them. And it's interesting that in that description, it's actually the German style, if you want to keep it in his framing, that his team sometimes seems more vulnerable to. That's surprising given that they were unbeaten in Germany last season. But I do think the defence is still a weakness. I think that, as I said before, even in that Feyenoord game, there were moments when I thought this could go a different way. It's not going a different way, but it could, because they are, I think, still... If there's one thing I don't have confidence that he's worked out, it's how to handle that very aggressive man-on-man. Defensively, I think his teams sometimes handle that very well going forwards, but that vulnerability, except perhaps in a game where they treat themselves like the underdog, which they did against Bayern Munich, again, completely renouncing possession, I think they are a team that can still be got at, I guess.
I think that's part of the development, isn't it? And I think that Bayern game could turn out to be a key for them in this season. Now, I think you look at the corresponding fixture last season, which was a 2-2 draw, very exciting. And you looked at that and you thought, okay, Leverkusen, I don't think anyone believed they were potential champions at that point, but you thought they're a serious team with good players. They can go to Bayern and go toe-to-toe with them. Whereas Nicky says they took the choice not to do that. Now, Bayern are very aggressive under Vincent Kompany. So for them to work out a way of doing that, and yeah, they did concede a goal, but it was a banger from Pavlovic from miles out. And Jonathan Tah was asked afterwards about the numbers, and he said, the journalist said to him, look, they've had loads more possession, more shots. It's quite a passive Leverkusen, which we're maybe not used to. Do you think you're a bit lucky? And he said, well, no, because if they had like 5-6 good chances to score, then maybe you'd be able to say they were lucky. But most of their efforts were from outside the box. Now, the one that sticks in everyone's mind from last weekend is the one where Serge Gnabry hit the post and hit the bar in the space of about 3 seconds. But apart from that, like Hradecky didn't have his busiest game in goal ever. And really, I think that's why it could be a pivotal moment, because there's full defensive buy-in for the first time. For a long time, they've been so good and they've got such incredible powers of recovery that they've almost lost that attention to defensive detail. So they've thought, yeah, we'll concede a goal. We'll bring on the subs and we'll come back. It'll be fine. We've done it before a million times. We've done it against Karabakh. We've done it against Dortmund. We've done it against all these, mentioned Gladbach, Wolfsburg this season. But after the Wolfsburg game that they won 4-3 the week before, and they were 3-2 down in that, Granit Xhaka came out and said, look, this is unacceptable. We're meant to be a great team, and a great team can't be letting in 3 goals in 45 minutes. And it gave them this like public dressing down that Alonso didn't. And I think Alonso kind of leans on Xhaka for that sometimes. And Simon Rolfes says it in the Amazon documentary they have on Leverkusen's last season, where he said, we want him to lead and we want him to sometimes let himself be a bit unpleasant, was the way he put it. To give us these words that maybe people don't really want to hear sometimes. And since they've had that telling off from Xhaka, they've gone and got that draw at Bayern and kept Milan out. Though I think you could tell in the last 25 minutes of this Milan game, they kind of sat a little bit through tiredness from that Bayern game and having to play 2 massive games in the space of a few days, which again reminds us of what a heavy schedule all these teams have.
You can't write them off in the Bundesliga, but what about in the Champions League? Nicky, how far can this Leverkusen team get in the Champions League? Can they win it?
Yeah, I guess the other thing that just came into my head is I think I was on right after Leverkusen did lose in the league to Leipzig, and we were asking at the time, is it almost... well, I guess where does it go from here? Does that loss break something, or is it a release? And frankly, I think it's not even a couple of months, is it? It's a month and a half on. It feels like it's made no change at all. They're still as confident as they were before. I don't see why they can't go far in the Champions League. They've started well. I will say this Milan team is not in a good place right now, so I don't think that result is a surprise to me. I think there are teams that I probably still rank ahead of Leverkusen in what I expect from them at the end of the competition, but I think Leverkusen have shown that they can mix it with more or less anyone.
Andy?
Yeah, I think they're a genuine contender. I would be really surprised if they're not top 8. Because we have to talk about that now in terms of qualification, don't they? Because top 8 guarantees you going straight through to the last 16 and no playoffs, which again will be a huge advantage to them. I think their game management and Alonso's game management is excellent. I think on paper they've had a good start to the season, but if you've actually watched the games, you'll know that there's a long way to improve, and I think that's what makes them dangerous going into the back half of this competition.
They do have a couple of tough games in their group phase to come. They're going away to Liverpool. They're playing Inter at home. They've got Atletico away, and Atletico obviously had a bad result this week, so there's potential that could end up being an important game for those top 8 places. So we'll see. But I'm with Andy on instinct. I think they are a top 8 team.